We fight like hell, and if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore.
Take out Trump, right? And they think they're gonna win again?
Madam Speaker, the Vice President and the United States Senate.
Mike Pence is going to have to come through for us, and if he doesn't, that will be a sad day for our country.
Got to storm the Capitol. We're going to break the doors down. They're already at the doorstep.
Madam Speaker and members of Congress.
They want you to think we're weak. They want you to think no one feels the way you do. I submit to you that we are much stronger than them.
We are mad.
We are much stronger than they are. We are many.
It's not about the good people of Arizona.
And it will stand in recess until the call of the chair.
Waking up today, it's like any other day, but it's not. Think about what happened on January 6th, the insurrection, the violence. But you also think about everything that's happened since then. All the evidence they have uncovered, all the trials, and hopefully the trials that are going to come up for the people who are in charge.
It's a very emotional day for me. I've waited for 2 years for this moment. There are people that are denying the horrors of January 6, 2021, and we can never let this happen again.
The morning of the insurrection, Howie was in his normal, happy, cheerful mood. As he left for work, I told him, not to run towards danger, but to come back home to his wife. We both laughed because we knew that Howie was the kind of person who took his job seriously and gave 100%. But we had no idea what was to come.
I joined the military to serve and go overseas in Iraq. But January 6th, it was another beast. It was a tragedy that would have cost the American democracy.
The Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol will be in order. 200 years ago, in 1801, The House of Representatives did one of its jobs laid out in the Constitution. After a deadlock in the Electoral College, this body cast 36 ballots and ultimately settled the contest for President of the United States. What followed was the first peaceful transfer of power in our country's history. And while Joe Biden is the legitimately elected President of the United States, a peaceful transfer of power didn't happen this year. Let that sink in. Think about it.
You know, it was so much going on that day. It's funny, like, where do you start?
And we won it by a landslide. This was not a close election. You know, I say sometimes jokingly, but there's no joke about it. I've been in 2 elections.
Over my career, been part of over 1,000 First Amendment protests. But going into that day, I just expected a protest. I expected a long day. I expected civil disobedience, but I didn't expect an insurrection and individuals attempting to physically overthrow the government with violence.
Gathered together in the heart of our nation's capital for one very, very basic and simple reason: to save our democracy.
Didn't expect that at all.
USA! USA! USA!
Our initial assignment was to go down to Constitution Avenue and just be highly visible. Let people know that the police are there, we're watching, which it just involves us standing outside, keeping an eye on the crowd.
That day for me started off pretty much like any other day. Got up and went to the gym, worked out. It was probably about late morning when I was back at home that I got a phone call from my partner at the time, a guy named Jimmy Albright. And Jimmy was telling me that he was hearing from guys that were working that there was something happening over at the Ellipse where the Stop the Steal rally was taking place.
Even our enemies want to be free. Even though
On the 6th, I actually did not know what was happening at the Capitol.
The Senate and House of Representatives are meeting in joint session.
I was working that day. I was working from home, and I did not have access to TV.
We will stop this.
I did not have access to my phone, the ability to check internet and things like that. So I did get a phone call from Brian, his mother. She was very concerned about something going on at the Capitol.
we are many.
Of course, I didn't know what she was seeing, so I texted him. I did not call him. That's the one thing I regret today. But I only texted him, but he got back to me. And so once he got back to me, I relaxed, and I thought everything was fine.
Trump's speech is over. It was awesome. Some of you may have seen it online. He went over all the voter fraud. We're walking over to the Capitol right now, and I don't know, maybe we'll break down the doors.
After the speaking in the park ended, the crowd began to move in the opposite direction. The radio, and we could hear that the commander, who was in charge that day for the events, was getting more and more agitated with protesters at the Capitol building until he eventually called for backup and said, any rapid response platoons would come back them up at the Capitol.
We just had protesters. Keep circle, breach the line. We need backup.
Once we got that, we ran back to the vans that we took down to Constitution Avenue, started putting on all our hard gear, and made our way to the Capitol.
Jeff was assigned to a civil disturbance unit on January 6th and sent to the Capitol. Jeff, he had not been to the Capitol since he was probably 10 years old, and as a Metropolitan Police Department officer, they weren't responsible for knowing the grounds of the Capitol.
I remember turning on my police radio and listening to reports of individuals who had participated in the Stop the Steal rally and had marched towards the Capitol and had broken through police lines, and that they were calling for MPD officers to respond to the Capitol to assist U.S. Capitol Police.
A lot of the rioters that day told us that they were there to stop the steal.
Are there any objections to counting the certificate of vote of the state of Arizona that the teller has verified appears to be regular in form and authentic?
Mr. Vice President, I, Paul Gosar from Arizona.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona rise?
I rise for myself and 60 of my colleagues to object to the counting of the electoral ballots from Arizona.
Is the objection in writing and signed by a senator?
Yes, it is.
Donald Trump, you could see, even before the election, was hedging.
The only way we're going to lose this election is if the election is rigged. Remember that.
And so you started to see those seeds being laid.
We still have more than 100 days to this election, but at this point, you're losing.
First of all, I'm not losing because those are fake polls.
There's this huge group of people who are huge Donald Trump fans, the Proud Boys, stand back and stand by. And Trump played with that and flirted with that. And so there were a lot of folks who really believed that Trump spoke for them. And so then when he didn't win, and he started immediately spreading the big lie and telling the big lie all the way through, people were there to respond to that. They fed on that.
Madam Speaker, Americans instinctively know there was something wrong with this election. During the campaign, Vice President Biden would do an event and he'd get 50 people at the event. President Trump, at just one rally, gets 50,000 people.
Madam Speaker, I have constituents outside this building right now. I promised my voters to be their voice. In this branch of government, which I now serve, it is my separate but equal obligation to weigh in on this election and object.
What does it say to the nearly half the country that believes this election was rigged if we vote not even to consider the claims?
You know, there are some people that supported Donald Trump because of his patriotic rhetoric. I was one of those people at one point. I was a single issue voter in 2016 and my issue was law enforcement, and I saw it as a no-brainer voting for somebody who at least purported to support law enforcement versus candidates that were calling for defunding the police, and also a political party that I think was inspiring violence against police officers. Having the benefit of hindsight now, I mean, you see that, the rhetoric that was used as part of that rally that day by Trump and some of his supporters, clearly stirred up this crowd that was already angry.
We made our way to the northwestern portion of the Capitol lawn. We got out on foot and formed up into two columns and started making our way towards the West Terrace. When we were marching towards the West Terrace, the crowd was very present. They saw us and they were more satisfied with just insulting us, calling us names. Traitors, oath breakers, that kind of thing. And eventually they attacked us.
We're going to give riot warnings as soon as the outlet is here. We're going to give riot warnings. We're going to try to get compliance, but this is now effectively a riot.
49 hours declaring it a riot.
5 to 50 be advised, Capitol Police 1 advised they're trying to breach and get into the Capitol. 50, I copy.
I had never been to the Capitol before. That's not really part of MPD's normal patrol duties. So we didn't really know exactly where we were. I tried to carve a path through the crowd for the rest of my platoon to follow. They cut off our platoon. It was completely surrounded by a huge crowd. I couldn't see the end of it. We formed the thin blue line, just a small line of officers against the tens of thousands. And we held it for as long as we could.
We have a breach of the Capitol! Breach of the Capitol to the upper level!
Jack, be advised, they're requesting additional resources on the east side as they've broken into that window and they're trying to kick it in.
At that time, it seemed like it was 40 officers versus 15,000. And I think in a way it was. That seemed to be the pinnacle of the violence that day. And that was the main focal point for that crowd that was out on the West Terrace to try to gain entry into the Capitol. I started in the back of that group of officers, and for whatever reason, I felt compelled to make my way to the front.
You got 10,000 people attacking the police officer in full uniform. There's no mistaking about it, that they know what they're doing. They're breaching the Capitol. They're telling me they're going to execute people inside the building. And if they have to go through me and the other officers, they will.
On January 6th, it took it to a whole nother level. It was an assault. It was un-American. It was undemocratic. It was just violence.
We're trying to hold the upper deck. We are trying to hold the upper deck now. We need to hold the doors of the Capitol.
I heard a distress call come out over the radio for the lower West Terrace tunnel. When you get down to the bottom of the stairs, there's a short kind of breezeway that leads up to a set of double doors. And I remember first looking through the double doors, which have glass pane, and I could see through the glass this white haze. And it was like the residual gas that was just kind of floating in the air from the CS gas canisters that had been deployed. I later learned that while most of them were deployed by law enforcement, that many of the rioters had come prepared, and they actually brought with them these oven mitts. When the CS gas canisters come out, they're hot as hell. And so they would pick them up and then throw them back into the tunnel where they would, have hell of an effect on a bunch of officers that are confined to a very small space.
Eventually, I made my way to the front of the tunnel there, and we were pushing, they were pushing, hitting us with police shields, and I sort of braced myself against a metal door frame in the tunnels to use as support, because every time we pushed forward, otherwise we were pushing off against our own people. And I found myself trapped against the door frame. One of the terrorists had me pinned with a riot shield. And the way I was pinned, my arms were just sort of like this, and I had no functional use of them, no strength really. And I was standing up straight, so I couldn't get myself out of it. I was completely vulnerable. One of the terrorists took advantage of my vulnerability. He had his phone out, but he put it in his mouth so that both of his hands were free to assault me. He grabbed my gas mask, started slamming my head back and forth, and then started ripping off my gas mask because it's airtight against your face, but he was pulling it and straining against my neck, and eventually he was able to rip it off my head. So he was able to grab my baton and rip it away from me, and then he beat me in the head with it. I could taste the blood coming out of my mouth, and the lack of a gas mask and all the chemical munitions on my face, I could feel my senses, sort of diminishing a little bit. And I knew that if I stayed in that position, if I took another blow like that, I could very easily suffer permanent damage or be killed. Or just, lose consciousness, get dragged out into the mob and lynched, or at best be a liability to my colleagues. So I did the only thing I could do at that point and called for help.
I was behind Hodges. He was getting trampled, and I could hear him scream, literally one or two officers behind him, and there's nothing I could have done.
I started to yell out, "Who needs a break? Who needs help?" I remember there were no volunteers, but there were officers that would identify their colleagues that were in need of assistance. And people started handing officers back to get medical attention. We had no EMTs, no fire rescue because they couldn't gain access into the building. So it was like officers triaging other officers. And then eventually I made my way to the front. And I found myself maybe 250, 300 feet away from the rest of the officers out in the crowd. While I was being pulled out, I was being struck by hands, what seemed like metal objects from pretty much every direction. I remember hearing people yelling out, I got one, and I remember people grabbing at my gun and trying to grab my weapon. And I just did everything that I could to maintain control of my gun. People were yelling to kill him with his own gun. And it was a very intense, very violent moments. The next thing I remember is being struck with a taser. And it was multiple times, just at the base of my skull. And I really thought that I was going to lose control of my gun at that point. I mean, the purpose of a taser is to incapacitate a person. And I was very concerned that if I lost control of my gun, that it would be used against me. And then at some point, I remember yelling out that I have kids. It definitely resonated with at least a few people that were in the crowd, because while some were continuing to assault me, there were a few that stepped in. We're almost fighting with those individuals to offer me protection. The next thing I remember is waking up on my back inside the tunnel.
We need EMTs now!
Mike, stay in there, buddy. Mike, it's Jimmy, I'm here.
I was driven by my partner to the hospital and admitted, and that's where I learned that I'd suffered a heart attack. They told me my troponin levels had spiked, and my blood pressure was obviously through the roof. So I was admitted there, and later diagnosed not only with the heart attack, but with having a traumatic brain injury associated with the assault on me that day, and PTSD. So it was a hell of a day.
After we lost the police line, we went inside the tunnel. I spent 3 hours defending the Capitol. At one point, Michael Fanone released me. And the only reason why I left, that was to use the bathroom, because I couldn't hold it no more. There's no doubt in my mind that if I had stayed there, whatever happened to Michael Fanone, it would have happened to me. The guilt comes in, the triggers, and I'm sure if I would have had stayed there, Michael Fanone would have gotten beat up. When we lost the police line, we felt defeated.
With January 6th, the officers who were brutalized on that day, struggling with not just the physical injuries and the lifelong result of that, but also the psychological injuries, PTSD, depression, anxiety, and just, some of them had to take leave because they could not go back to work right away. So, it really has a long-lasting impact. And then that's just on them. Then when we look at the families are left to pick up the pieces. So if you have a significant other, partner, spouse, they're left there to clean up the mess that the perpetrators committed, because then they have this whole new person that they're living with that has just virtually changed almost overnight because of what happened to them.
Officer Howard Liebengood. He was a U.S. Capitol Police officer, a 15-year veteran, and he basically grew up in the Capitol Hill community. He was Senate page, he was a doorkeeper, and he joined U.S. Capitol Police in 2005. And on January the 6th, he was on duty. And I think the events that occurred that day were so traumatizing to him. It struck him to his core. And then he worked around the clock on the 6th, the 7th, the 8th, and the 9th with very few hours in between his shift. And on the 9th, a few hours after his shift, he took his life. I want people to know about Private First Class Liebengood and what he did for the country. I want them to realize that he was a generous, kind, compassionate person. It didn't matter what your political beliefs were or what your rank or title was. He respected and loved, everyone. And he brought this passion and devotion to his job. And I think ultimately this devotion to his job, putting service before self, ultimately led him to take his life.
It's not a pretty day on January 6th when the brutality and the pain and the struggle on display during that day did not end on January 6th. In fact, in quick succession in the days after, 4 police officers who fought that violent mob went on to take their own lives, all in the wake of the attack.
Jeff was assigned to a civil disturbance unit on January 6th and sent to the Capitol. He went to work as the Jeff that I knew. He was funny. He was dancing through the house, playing with a dog, and he was just himself. When he returned, he was very different. At the time, I wasn't aware of everything that had happened, but I knew something wasn't right. I just couldn't put my finger on it.
Race to the Capitol. Body camera footage obtained by CBS News reveals Jeff arrived on the front lines as rioter Ashley Babbitt was shot and killed while trying to breach a smashed window near the U.S. House floor.
Obviously, he had gone through a very traumatic event that day, as every police officer who was there went through. But he was up at night, not sleeping, just emotional, just wasn't the jokester that left that morning. He did go to the clinic after that day because of his injuries, and they sent him home. He was home for a few days, and then they ordered him back to work. He left for work on the 15th of January and never came home.
It was a very difficult and lengthy process to identify what happened to Jeff that day. We had to conduct a very extensive investigation in order to learn where inside the building or outside the building Jeff was. There were tens of thousands of people there that day, and the Washington, D.C. police were all wearing gas masks and helmets and visors, and they were all dressed exactly the same. So a lot of the technology that's been used to identify assailants was not available to us with regards to finding Jeff. Ultimately, with the help of volunteers, we reviewed approximately 44,000 hours of YouTube video in order to locate Jeff in the riot.
Pushing on the door. Hold this door, and then isn't there a way to lock it? Oh my God. It broke the hinge when it came in. Yeah.
The review of the YouTube video ultimately found where Jeff was in the Capitol that day. And from that, we were then able to focus on other video to see what happened to him. And what became apparent very quickly, Jeff was actually attacked twice. And in the first attack, Jeff was disarmed and had his baton taken from him. And he was struck at least twice and possibly 3 times in the face with his baton.
Then there's this. Now, outside the Capitol, a metal pole sails in from the crowd, hitting Jeff head on.
The video that we were ultimately able to obtain showed that he was knocked unconscious. I read a recent statistic that said that in a typical year, over 700 law enforcement officers commit suicide, okay? But what is not investigated is what was the basis for the suicide. So in Jeff's case, we have scientific evidence that he did not die of a self-inflicted wound because he was weak or trying to escape his emotion, or in any of the ways that many people try to stigmatize people who have mental illness or suicide, but that in fact the post-concussive syndrome, the fact that he had his face broken, that it caused brain damage, is what ultimately led to the depression and his death.
Prior to my husband's death, police suicides were brushed under the rug. They weren't talked about. They were ignored. It was a stigma that the police departments didn't want to face. Because of the events of January 6th and everything that led to his death, he has changed the conversation where now the federal government has recognized that police suicides are a line of duty death and they deserve the same benefits as any other police officer, no matter how they die, whether from COVID, a heart attack, or suicide.
Today is January 27th, 2023, and today is the sentencing date for George Tanyos and Julian Cater, the two men responsible for assaulting my long-term partner, Brian Sicknick. And I am in Washington, D.C. at the Capitol, right near the West Front, where Brian was and where many other officers were and assaulted. And it feels surreal standing here this morning before going to the courthouse to give my victim impact statement. When I saw George Tanyos and Julian Cater for the first time in person, it was a mix of emotions. I felt sadness for them because they were put in that position, in a sense, because they were led by a former president who lied to them and riled them up to the point that they sacrifice their lives, really, their well-being for him. But also anger because they assaulted and planned to assault someone that I love very dearly and care about. And they made his last moments on earth hell.
The New Jersey man who assaulted a Capitol police officer on January 6th has been sentenced. Julian Cater will spend about 6.5 years behind bars.
This new video shows one of the men accused in the assault, Julian Cater, with his arms stretched out, seeming to spray officers with what prosecutors have simply described as a chemical spray.
Julian Cater was sentenced to, I believe, over 6 years in prison, but 2 of those years were suspended due to time served. George Tanyos, he was sentenced to 100 hours of community service and 1 year of supervised release. And initially I was more angry about George Tanyos and his sentence because it felt like kind of like a slap on the wrist, but I have my lawsuit pending, so that still gave me some comfort that, you know, I still have another avenue to seek justice.
With being the representative of Officer Sicknick's estate, and I think it's important to note that it's the estate that's suing. It's not Sandra as the longtime partner suing, because some will say, well, she's trying to, benefit from it. She does represent the estate, but it is the estate. It is the damage to Officer Sicknick. And in fact, any funds we obtain from it, we've already publicly stated, are going to be donated to a charity that Sandra believes Brian would have wanted or did support. So this is not about money, it is only about accountability. The ultimate objective is to hold those responsible, to hold Donald Trump accountable for his conduct that day and leading up to it, and to make sure that something like this never happens again. And ultimately, I brought in these 2 other firms to work with us because it's a collaborative effort.
I think there are a lot of people working on January 6th and January 6th issues. Congress, I think, did a great job. I know there may be a criminal prosecution based on that, but the civil process, bringing this lawsuit, I think is an important part of developing that record. After the Civil War, as a part of the Reconstruction process in this country, Congress passed what was called the Ku Klux Klan Act. And the purpose of the Ku Klux Klan Act was to allow people to sue when there's a conspiracy to interfere with a government process, with a government function. And that's what we sued under. We sued Trump and these two men who attacked Officer Sicknick for conspiring together to interrupt the government functioning, to interrupt Congress, keep it from certifying the Electoral College vote. If it weren't for Donald Trump, if it weren't for these two men attacking Officer Sicknick would be alive today and would be with his fiancée and would be having a good full life. But of course, Donald Trump took that away from him.
There is still, 2 years later, a lot of emotion tied to January 6th. And sad to say, there is a lot of emotion tied to supporters of those from January 6th. And as time goes by, I'm not seeing that lessens, that the facts sort of open their eyes of, oh my God, really? That's what happened? That's wrong. We should never do that in a democracy. No, I'm seeing more along the lines of those who have been prosecuted are political prisoners, that they don't think they did anything wrong, that they would do it again. And of course, Donald Trump is continually fueling the fire with this, that Ashley Babbitt, one of the tragic deaths of that day, shot by a police officer, that she was executed, meaning unlawfully. It's a nightmare.
After Brian died, I got a very hateful letter in the mail. I still don't know who this person was, but they sent me a letter in the mail saying, I'm glad Brian is dead, and I hope more officers follow in his footsteps. So this is the kind of stuff that other people typically don't have to deal with, but it's a reality for myself, and other survivors in these kind of situations, and the agony with it was just horrible. Well, basically, facts are facts. If they look at the footage that happened, it's very obvious that that was not a peaceful day. Police officers were getting attacked, they were getting beaten, fire extinguishers were thrown at them, they were being attacked by flagpoles. Mike and Officer Dunn here, they can basically tell you right now what they experienced, and it wasn't a tourist day. It wasn't tourists just passively walking by.
If January 6th didn't happen, Brian would still be here, plain and simple.
This has probably been among the most important cases that I've worked on in my career. Aaron and Jeffrey Smith have forever changed the conversation about mental health and silent injuries to those who protect us in this country. The federal law has actually changed, and the legislative history references Jeff and Aaron on the Senate floor.
In addition, we want police departments across the nation to recognize that no matter how an officer dies, every death should be investigated and determined if it's line of duty. It shouldn't matter if they died by suicide or if they died in a car accident. A death is a death, and the departments need to recognize that.
Police officers have a 54% greater risk of suicide than the American population in general. Officers not only sustain severe physical injuries, there are many more scores of officers who sustain mental injuries. These are fathers, their mothers, their husbands, their wives who bravely put their lives on the line each and every day. And it's important for us to make sure that our protectors are protected.
On that fateful day, President Trump's words were reckless. They endangered my family and everyone at the Capitol. But the American people deserve to know that on that day, President Trump also demanded that I choose between him and the Constitution. Now voters will be faced with the same choice.
We're at a unique moment in history, right? Where, and I feel like we're teetering on a knife's edge in a lot of ways. And we could stay a democracy in the way that we all learned that the country is in our, junior high civics class, or we could fall into something darker. It's important that we do what we have to develop a historical record, so that the next time this happens in 50 years or 100 years, people look back and they see what Donald Trump did. They see the ugly currents in American politics, and they know how to watch out for people exploiting those.
And we become president, and you are the happiest people.
January 6th, I could not believe the phone call I got. It was Capitol Police. So I was thinking, oh my God, was he shot? And I kept asking, and the officer on the other line wouldn't tell me. He just said I needed to get to the hospital right away. And then I got to the hospital, and that was just another nightmare in and of itself. I got there, and the doctor told me that basically he was on a ventilator, and I knew then. I asked if I could go back and see him, and they would not let me go back there to see him, which was even more devastating because of COVID. When I got in the hospital room, he was laying there, and I remember I initially reached out for his hand, to touch his hand, and it was cold. And I remember that was really uncomfortable for me. So I put my hand on his forearm, and his forearm was still warm. And so I kept my hand on his forearm. I just was talking to him. And I was just telling him how much I loved him, and I couldn't believe that he was gone. And after sitting there for a while, I got up and I kissed his forehead. Sorry. And I just told him that I would love him forever and always. Thank you. So that was really hard. Thank you.
And it will happen as the court is releasing new videos of the assault on 3 Capitol Police officers, including Brian Sicknick, who died a day later after several strokes, which the medical examiner attributed to natural causes.
Would you pray with me? Still our hearts, O God, in this moment, as overwhelmed as we are with grief, shock, uncertainty, even anger, and all the other emotions that invade this hallowed occasion. Sanctify this place with your holy presence.
The cremains of Officer Brian Sicknick are being taken to Arlington National Cemetery. He was 42 years old when he died defending the Capitol and Congress from an attack on January 6th. Another 140 officers were injured that day. Officer Sicknick is one of only 5 private citizens who have lain in honor in the U.S. Capitol.
That was scary that day because of my physical safety, but in the weeks following, the months following, and all the stuff that we're learning about how close we came to losing it, it becomes even more scarier.
I now recognize Officer Dunn to summarize his testimony.
At the top of the stairs, I confronted a group of insurrectionists, warning them do not go down those steps. One of them shouted, "Keep moving, patriots." Another displayed what looked like a law enforcement badge and told me, "We're doing this for you." How can these thin blue lines that everybody talks about in the police that we held off, what if we didn't? Does our democracy fail because of that? All those back the blue and support our law enforcement, all that stuff is just talking points. There's stuff that just sounds good on a sound clip, a sound bite, you know, until actually people put their actions or their votes behind those words, it don't mean anything. Anybody can go put a thin blue line sticker on their car or put in their Twitter handle, "We support police." But until your actions show that, no matter what, then you're full of it.
I got real pissed off a few weeks ago when a bunch of Pennsylvania state troopers posed in uniform with their department's insignia with Donald Trump. This is Donald Trump. Donald Trump, the same motherfucker that sent thousands of his supporters to the Capitol to attack police officers. Because who do you think was protecting that goddamn building? It wasn't going to be Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. It was going to be me and my colleagues at the Metropolitan Police Department and U.S. Capitol Police. And so, you know, the fact that you would pose in a picture with somebody who is, you know, in my mind, the biggest mass police assaulter of our time, it's just fucking outrageous. There weren't a lot of black and brown faces in that fucking picture. There's a bunch of white fucking cops from Pennsylvania posing with Donald Trump. And I'm not going to say, you can draw your own conclusions. But, you know, it's like, if it walks like a duck, it quacks like a fucking duck, it looks like a fucking duck, it's a goddamn duck.
On January 6th, everybody knew who did it. January 7th, they knew who did it. A week later, they were like, oh, well, nothing happened here. And they decided to play politics for a tragedy that would have cost the American democracy.
These are not hardened thugs, murderers, or gang members with long histories of crimes. These are not unruly or dangerous, violent criminals.
If you didn't know the TV footage was a video from January the 6th, you would actually think it was a normal tourist visit.
That same congressman shown in this picture, trying to barricade the door on January 6th.
Yeah, it's disturbing. The Capitol Police officer that did the shooting actually appeared to be hiding, lying in wait, and they gave no warning before killing her. Question again, why hasn't that officer that executed Ashley Babbitt been named?
And look here, look.
Ted Cruz's objection to the Arizona.
His objection. He was going to sell us out all along. Really? Look, objection to counting electoral votes of the state of Arizona. Can I get a photo of that? Wait, no, that's okay. All right,
You never use words carelessly, and yet you called this a terror attack when by no definition was it a terror attack. That's a lie. You told that lie on purpose, and I'm wondering why you did.
What I was referring to are the limited number of people who engaged in violent attacks against police officers. Now, I think you and I both agree that if you assault a police officer, you should go to jail. I wasn't saying that the thousands of peaceful protesters supporting Donald Trump are somehow terrorists. I wasn't saying the millions of patriots across the country supporting President Trump are terrorists.
What you just said doesn't make sense.
I have referred to people who violently assault police officers as terrorists. I've done so over and over and over again. If you look at all the assaults we've seen across the country, I've called that terrorism over and over again. That being said, Tucker, I agree with you. It was a mistake to say that yesterday, and the reason is what you just said.
Well, let me give you my view of what happened January the 6th. And we're here. We saw what happened. It was a violent insurrection for the purpose of trying to prevent the peaceful transfer of power after a legitimately certified election. I've made the decision to oppose the House Democrats' slanted and unbalanced proposal for another commission to study the events of January the 6th. It's not at all clear what new facts or additional investigation yet another commission could actually lay on top of existing efforts by law enforcement.
One thing that I find very disappointing is some of the people that we protected they defend the very same rioters who were hunting them down room by room.
You pay for it. This is our house. These are dads, brothers, veterans, teachers. All political prisoners who continue to be persecuted and endure the pain of unjust suffering. I have repeatedly called for all individuals arrested for illegal acts on January 6 to be treated fairly. They are deserving of equal justice under the law.
The day of our testimony to Congress, there was a group of people, elected officials, that went to petition the Department of Justice to argue for those same very rioters who attacked them and us, saying that those people are patriots and that they needed to be released as soon as possible. What they telling me with their action is, to them, we, the police officer, we are the bad guys.
I've said many times, like, I don't know how these Capitol Police officers continue to come into work every day knowing that their bosses don't even give a shit enough about their personal safety to address some of the issues that led to January 6th. I mean, that in addition to the fact that, like, you've got dozens of members of Congress who are insurrectionists. I mean, I left Capitol Police a long time ago, and I'll tell you, like, there were a lot of reasons behind it. The main reason was, you know, as a U.S. Capitol Police officer, your job is to secure the Capitol grounds and members of Congress. Essentially, you need to be willing to trade your life for a member of Congress. And there ain't one goddamn member of Congress that I'd fucking trade my life, let alone, you know, my worst enemy's life for.
My life had been changed. I thought I was going to retire as a police officer on my own terms. I had to do it now because of my disability. Many of my fellow Capitol officers, as well as MPD officers, suffer terrible physical injuries from the violence inflicted on us on January 6. I sustained injuries on both my hands, my left shoulder, my left calf, and my right foot. I already had undergone bone fusion surgery on my right foot, and I was just told that I need surgery on my left shoulder. I have been on medical and administrative leave for much of the past 6 months, and I expect to need further rehabilitation for possibly more than a year.
Sergeant Gunnell has a military background where it's well known he had suffered PTSD, so that traumatized him further on January 6th. This was probably worse than what he experienced in Iraq in the time he served there on active duty, in facing literally American citizens, fellow citizens, attacking him to the point where he wasn't sure if he would survive to the end of the day.
I can't hug my wife or my son the way I want to sometimes. It's still painful. There's a lot of things that changed my life, but I think staying quiet is not one of those. There are some who express outrage when someone kneels while calling for social justice. Where are those same people expressing the outrage to condemn the violence attack on law enforcement, the Capitol, and our American democracy?
I don't think January 6th was a racist event, but I believe there were a lot of racists there that day. More and more insurrectionists were pouring into the area by the speaker's lobby near the rotunda, and some wearing MAGA hats and shirts that said Trump 2020. I told them to just leave the Capitol, and in response they yelled, "No, man, this is our house. President Trump invited us here. We're here to stop the steal. Joe Biden is not the president. Nobody voted for Joe Biden." I'm a law enforcement officer, and I do my best to keep politics out of my job. But in this circumstance, I responded, "Well, I voted for Joe Biden. Does my vote not count? Am I nobody? That prompted a torrent of racial epithets. One woman in a pink MAGA shirt yelled, "You hear that, guys? This voted for Joe Biden." Then the crowd, perhaps around 20 people, joined in screaming, "Boo, fucking." While it happened, I didn't process it as me being attacked for the color of my skin. While it happened, I was just trying to make it home and survive through that day. But once when I had a moment to process it, and like, wow, I'm being attacked for existing as a black person, that it hurt. It hurt.
Without objection, I include in the record a video presentation of the violence of January 6th.
We're trying to hold the upper deck. We are trying to hold the upper deck now. We need to hold the doors of the Capitol. I need court support. We lost the line. We lost the line. All MPDs get back.
I'm here to serve my country. And, you know, as a black person, as a black man, every black officer, I think, there that day fought a different battle.
Even through my mask, they saw my skin color and said, "You're not even an American." When I was 25 years old, and then a sergeant in the Army, I had deployed to Iraq. In Iraq, we expected armed violence because we were in a war zone. But nothing in my experience in the Army or as a law enforcement officer prepared me for what we confronted on January 6th.
But the fact that they brought race into it and used that as a weapon, that was hard to deal with.
You described talking to your fellow black officer about what you went through and experiencing those racial epithets. You asked a question, I think, that I've been haunted by ever since. Is this America? And I'm very interested to know your thoughts on the answer to that question. Is this America what you saw?
It sounds silly, but I guess it is American. And it's so, but it's not the side of America that I like. It's not the side of that any of us here represent. We represent the good side of America, the people that actually believe in decency and human decency, and we appeal to just the good in people. I'm reminded every day that that building built by our ancestors, slaves, to represent what it does now, it's like it's come full circle. They, slaves, built that building. And now me, a descendant of those individuals, am there protecting it. So I look at it, I take my job as more than just a paycheck. It means a lot to me. I'm honored to protect that building.
One of the most important things for me is to protect and to help the U.S. Capitol Police officers that are there right now. A lot of them are still struggling with the grief and the trauma. After the insurrection, the Howard C. Liebengood Wellness Center was established to address the needs of the law enforcement community, and I am working to make sure that we are able to create a program that can address the needs of this ailing workforce. When I see many of Howie's colleagues, I see Howie, and I know that they aren't going to, raise their hand and ask for help. Having been married to Howie for almost a decade, I recognize a lot of the challenges in law enforcement, and it's important for me to make sure that I can be that vehicle, that I can be that voice to drive change. I have nothing to lose right now. I've already lost my husband, and I want to make sure that his death was not in vain.
I received a call earlier this week. I picked up, said it was from the White House, said that Biden wanted to give me this Presidential Citizens Medal. It's the second highest honor available to a non-military member in the country, which I was blown away. So it's an incredible honor.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, the President of the United States.
As the Constitution refers to us, we the people did not flinch. We the people endured. We the people prevailed. We honor a remarkable group of Americans who embodied the best before, during, and after January the 6th, 2021.
My motivation now for continuing to participate in this conversation isn't born out of anything other than I love my kids and I don't want them to grow up in a country that in any way resembles what we're dealing with right now.
For the first time in my presidency, I'm bestowing the Presidential Citizens Medal, one of our nation's highest civilian honors. And history will remember your names. It will remember your courage. It will remember your bravery. It will remember your extraordinary commitments to your fellow Americans. And it's not exaggeration to say, America owes you all. I really mean this. A debt of gratitude. One we can never fully repay unless we live up to what you did.
There are a lot of powerful interests being threatened by what happened that day. The lies are continuing even to this day, and they will continue probably for the rest of time.
What we went through was real, and the threat to the democracy is real.
The number one thing, though, that Republicans and Democrats have to face right now as a country, and independents, is the defense of democracy.
Today is the launch of the Howard C. Liebengood Foundation. Over the past couple of years, in my grief, I've struggled to make sure that his death was not in vain. Creating this foundation and rallying support allows me to make sure that the systems that failed Howie could be corrected.
As a suicide survivor and a physician with a background in public health, I realize there are tremendous opportunities to address this public health crisis.
President Biden wanted me to extend his personal congratulations on the launch of the foundation, condolences on the passing of her beloved husband and a friend to so many of us, and his enthusiasm for working with you. He was one of those courageous Americans who rushed toward danger regardless of personal risk to stand up for the rule of law. And he ultimately gave his life defending the democratic institutions he revered from a violent mob of insurrectionists.
Serena, in the wake of an unimaginable loss, you have honored Howie's life. All of us at the Justice Department are proud to stand alongside all of you in our shared commitment to supporting officer safety, health, and wellness. Every single day, law enforcement officers are asked to risk their lives as they respond to some of the most difficult moments that our communities will face. In doing so, they endure stress and trauma at a level that the rest of us cannot even begin to comprehend. They should not have to face that alone. They must not face that alone. We are with you.
I think the health and wellness of the law enforcement officers are at stake, they simply show up to work day after day just to do their jobs. This isn't about political ideologies. This is about serving and protecting democracy.
Justice to me is sort of the small J and the large J. The small J would be to hold accountable those who participated, supported, advocated for the actual events of January 6th. But the big J is the more important one, and that's to make sure that we learn from January 6th to make sure it doesn't happen again. So that instead of the Reichstag fire of 1933 in Germany actually fueling the rise of the Nazi Party to where we ended up for the next dozen years afterwards, that we look at January 6th and we go, that is not what we are about in American democracy, and we are not going to tolerate that from whatever party it might be that is trying to attack American democracy.
And if you put me back in the White House, their reign is over. Their reign will be over, and they know it. And America will be a free nation once again. We're not a free nation right now. We don't have free press. We don't have free anything. In 2016, I declared, I am your voice. Today I add, I am your warrior. I am your justice. And for those who have been wronged and betrayed, I am your retribution. I am your retribution. Not gonna let this.
I've been called a lot of names, and the two names that I resent the most are being called a Democrat because I dislike Donald Trump, and being called a Republican because I voted for Donald Trump. I do admit that I did not pay enough attention, like I think many Americans, to how fragile our democracy was prior to January 6, 2021. I do recognize how fragile our democracy is, and it has shaken my belief in our institutions of government, because they're only as strong as the people that lead them and participate in them.
Funding provided by the Joseph and Robert Cornell Memorial Foundation.